Cool. It says we're live on StreamYard. I'm not seeing us be live on YouTube, though. Is anybody else? We have to refresh.
Yep, live.
I can live? See live. Nice. Hey, that's us. Cool. Oh, I see. It's a little bit behind. Wow, we have 50 people watching. Welcome, everybody. I had to put the live stream on mute, so I was hearing myself, and that was really weird. Anybody joining in on the live stream, please utilize the chat like crazy. Introduce yourself. We will be talking about the future of web routing. We're mostly focused on 3 areas of that, which we'll go into more detail on, but we care about the developer experience. We care about the performance, and we care about the functionality, right? We'll go into sort of a whole theory we have on those 3 things and how it's often hard to get 3 of 3. You often get 1 or 2 of 3. Hey, Ryan's here. He's our favorite. Ryan, is a good time to ask you to join one of our future streams. We're going to ask you soon, but I figured you'd be open to it. So we'll talk to you about that.
Yeah, I think Ryan is here just to keep us honest.
Yeah, Ryan, you should utilize the chat like crazy. If you disagree with what we're saying or you want to add awesome things that Solid and Marco do, please do. Hey, Pierre. Hey, Dale. Hey, Glenn. Everybody, please introduce yourself, especially actually if you want to add more detail. Where are you chatting in from? What'd you do? What's your background? Do you work on an open source thing? Do you work at a cool company? Independent, stuff like that. But why don't we? Oh, that's cool. We got 7 likes. I love that everybody likes this already. We're just rambling at the moment. Oh, hey, David. Oh, we love your work on XState and everything. Oh, this will be fun. Because we have such an awesome group here, please utilize the chat like crazy. We want to make sure we're focusing on the topics that the room cares about. And the best way to do that is just let us know your opinions. Hey, Nikhil. So why don't we kick things off? Let me provide a little bit of background. We'll have some areas we want to discuss, and I'll kick things over to Adam, Manu, and Mishko. And like always, just hammer on the chat like crazy. We want to address those topics and questions as they come up. So I'll just kick things off for like a tiny bit of initial background. So when we look at routing, we're looking at a couple different areas. We are looking at what a star. Yes, this is a star cast in the chat. This is fun. But anyway, so I think we all know a couple things that are going on in the ecosystem that's quite interesting. Server-side routing has been the way that websites are built for ages, starting with you had index.html and you just hit the HTML file, evolved to like index.php where you can get a little more dynamic. Funny enough, things that seemed new in certain ways, like Next.js file system-based routing, obviously not the only framework that has done that and does do that, was kind of what PHP did in the beginning. Rails kind of added separation. We're adding sort of structure back. But the server-side routing that we're seeing especially become popular again with things like Astro or Quick or Marco is really interesting to explore. Server-side has interesting trade-offs. Client side has interesting trade-offs as well, or whatever you'd call something like a Next.js that starts server side and then continues in a way client side. Some would call that transitional. Some, like Ryan Mishko, would say it's not transitional, only Quick is transitional. And so those are some topics that we can definitely hit on here as well. But I think the really interesting topic here that was worth focusing on at the beginning is new approaches to routing, right? So I can give a couple examples. Number one is like React server components. For those who are not familiar, it's a sort of idea that routing, like my experience is with the Hydrogen framework by Shopify, where the server generates and sends the entire sort of VDOM for a page that can sort of stream in, and streaming we should touch on, data fetching and loading, all of that. But in the case of React server components, we will have a server generate VDOM, send that over the wire, and then React patch in the updates. So you get, in a sense, server-side routing, but you don't get that full page refresh where like all your third-party scripts are reloading and you have this slightly jarring experience in the browser. There are other people, like I saw like Theo at a Vercel meetup recently talk about, Guillermo asked him like, hey, does it bother you a full page refresh? And he was just like, no. So there's the bigger question, like, do refreshes even matter, right? That's another top of mind one. And the last one is when we're talking about new techniques, there's things like, frameworks like Quick that are kind of HTML first. What are the trade-offs of doing things like just patching inner HTML? Grab pieces of the next route, maybe use a nested layout system to fetch a portion of the page and just inner HTML that. we could explore other areas with Quick too, where we run a client side, where we do, I mean, there's interestingly, on the case of Quick, we have a new set of primitives that allow kind of all the options. And so we're allowed to sort of explore here. But that's also where you'll see if you get started with Astro, TurboLinks is an option, which TurboLinks was made a long time ago by the Rails team, if I remember right. And the GitHub page says absolutely deprecated, yet some people are using. That approach is interesting too. Fetch the entire new page HTML, patch in the body, diff in the scripts and other meta tags and stuff like that. And so I think one of the most interesting topics to start off here is with Adam. So starting with you on the spot. So Adam's been working on Quick City. Quick City is awesome. It's sort of that meta framework layer over Quick, where you can create nested layouts, a lot of awesome inspiration from things like Remix, Next.js, Solid Start, etc. And so I kind of want to start, Adam, what are your thoughts on routing? I talked about the generational stuff. There's the developer experience, and then we can have Mishka Mano and others comment on where should Quick go? Do we like the inner HTML format? Do we like client side? Do we like server side? I will shut up. Please, Adam, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think you already kind of hit a lot on it, whereas like the how things evolved over time, especially the index PHP, and each having the file-based routing. I think it's really cool because it kind of did come back because it wasn't that bad of an idea. I've even found myself on the Jekyll docs quite a bit of how does Jekyll do layouts and how did it do, the file-based routing. And I think that they kind of nailed it. There really was nothing broke there. Also want to say, as far as Quick City goes, we're absolutely 100% inspired by, SvelteKit, Remix, Astro, and Next.js. And even Next.js has their original way that they did pages. And now they have a new RFC for how they're going to do the app directory and the routes directory. So reviewed all of those, absolutely inspired by them of how we're doing it. But yeah, Quick City is basically the meta framework for what we're finishing up for Quick. And so it has the same kind of concepts of one for one of what is SvelteKit to Svelte, Quick City is to Quick. So same thing. So as far as routes go, I think what's really fun is kind of like, yeah, we had the passive like server side routing and it would respond with HTML. And then we were like, well, maybe that's not a good idea. It's kind of slow. What if we did, client side routing? We did all with the JavaScript. So let's build the entire thing with JavaScript. So we did that for a while as an industry. And we're like, that kind of has its trade-offs too. And so now we've hit this new era of like, why not both, right? Why not do client-side routing and server-side routing? And that's where kind of Next.js and Gatsby and all of them kind of like pioneered in that area. So I think that's the really, really fun stuff to get involved with is like, if you were using something like Django or, even WordPress, something like that, you were able to kind of mix the two, but you never really had the server side and the client side playing well together. You could kind of have Django build the HTML. And then once it got responded, once it hit the browser, then you had a jQuery or some sort of framework to put it together. And that really can kind of still be said about a lot of the traditional frameworks out there. It's like you've got, React is able to render the HTML, the server responds with HTML, and then some JavaScript picks it up and continues of where the HTML was built off of. So in that case, it's React also. So you write stuff in React and the JavaScript runs it in React. But really, if you take a step back, it's running twice somewhere in the world. You got the server that ran out the code, and then on the browser, it ran out the code. That's what's the fun part with Quick City is that we're kind of able to kind of rethink that. And, Mishko could go on and on about, resumability and being able to have the server run the code once, build that state of that HTML, and then the JavaScript may not ever run it at all. Doesn't need to run because we know what state we're at. And then when we do need it to run, it can be that pick and choose what parts of that state of the application would run. And so that's the fun part, I think, that's different with Quick City is really exploring that. And like you said, Steve, is we could just use TurboLinks type of concept of just inner HTML certain divs, which would be extremely fast. So right now we have just the server side part of it, and then the client side part of it is actually about just as simple to include. So hopefully the first version of Quick City that is usable to the public is going to have server-side, client-side already completed. But that's kind of the starting point, I think. I think there's a lot more to be done there in the routing world.
Yeah, it's wild. Yes, let me make one statement, and then we want to hear like an entire sort of your thoughts on this, Mishko. I just want to throw in that with Quick, we've been running some interesting experiments here, and I can say, we're seeing something fascinating, which is that it opens new options. for us on the approaches we want to take. So that's what I want to get to in a second, Mishko, is what is your thoughts on the future of web routing? What does a resumable router look like? Because we've discussed various things, but I can say one thing. A couple experiments we have run that I thought were interesting. First one is just typical browser prefetching. You have one page, you add the prefetch link to the next page, and you click to it. And in my experience, it's not that fast. It's not that much faster than pulling the next page off the CDN on demand from some tests we ran. One of the more interesting ones that I ran as an experiment and would need more work to fully implement is the turbo link style. If you're on a given page and you expect a certain next page or a set of next pages to run, and you prefetch that HTML and on click inner HTML, inline that HTML, that is the closest thing to an instant page transition I've ever experienced. If you've gone to the builder homepage, we have these tabs for like developers and business users. And if you do the prefetching, so right there in memory, either through Partytown, like the web worker, or in the main thread, and you literally just have the next HTML sitting there in memory, and then upon tap, it inlines it. It's just insanely fast. You can flip around pages, and it feels like nothing you've ever felt before. Quite a bit faster than client-side routing with something like Next.js, because there's just enormous less work to do. In fact, in profiling, I found the only bottleneck was HTML parsing, took a couple milliseconds. So started exploring pre-parsed HTML, generate real DOM nodes, and then just insert the real DOM node. And it was insane. But there's questions like, how does this actually scale? You know, as a reminder, and we'll go deeper on this, we care a ton about, you know, performance, developer experience, and the functionality, right? And we don't want to have trade-offs. We don't want to say, oh, you get 2 of the 3. So we'll go more on that. But Mishko, really curious your thoughts. Resumable routing, future of routing, how Quick can differentiate here, or what you think is interesting. I'm gonna shut up now and please rant about it all.
Yeah, this is my standard rant that I keep trying to convince everybody on. So I think before we dive into, I think the thing to talk about is that Quick has this, we really haven't talked about it much, but this idea of containers, which is like independent applications on a page. And, you know, the containers can be nested, and not all of this is yet built up, but like it's all in the space of like, oh, we're so close, we can kind of see it. And so when you have this world of individual containers, what you realize is really possible is like, oh, container is just inner HTML, because the inner HTML contains everything with it, right? It contains the state, it contains the subscriptions, it contains the listeners. Everything you need about the app is really just contained inside of the chunk of HTML. And so if you normally when you think about it, it's like, oh, it's just a single page, single application. But then you can just break this down into multiple containers on your page and say, like, actually, instead of thinking of the page as just a single large app, what if we thought about the page as a bunch of small containers, right? And each one of these containers has its own life cycle, has its own way of inner HTMLing and so on. And once you have this mental model, then the natural next step is to say, like, oh, when you have a router, you have this idea of a layout, and you have an idea of the outlet, right? The place where the individual thing goes. And if the outlet itself is just a container that you can inner HTML, then it becomes super trivial to just navigate to a new page, because you just inner HTML the piece of code in there. And of course, you can do all the things you talked about, like prefetching it. You can pre-parse it into a DOM node, etc. But because you have this particular mental model, the transitions become nice. Now, the other thing that kind of becomes nice is because the outer containers stay and they don't get destroyed, you can store state within them, right? Like part of the problem of MPA applications and multi-page is that every time you navigate to a new page, your state gets completely destroyed. So if you're logged in, etc., or if you type in your username or something of that sort, like it's just a shopping cart, it's gone. But with this approach, right, you could have the shell stay the same. It could have its state, and you're just replacing the inner container, the inner content, the outlet of the navigation. And so in my world, like I see it as the place for routing, I think, is the server, right? And but you don't have a MPA style application, which is a full page refreshes, but you start with a full page refresh on the initial one, which is kind of the standard MPA. But then everything else happens in the client, except that instead of saying like, oh, I'm going to page B, I need to therefore download a page B's JavaScript in order to render it on the client, which, as you pointed out, is kind of expensive. You could just go to the server and say, like, actually, I just want to go to page B. Could you just like give me the subcontainer of the page B that I just have to inner HTML to this location? And now all of a sudden you're on the same page. And of course, everything is resumable. And so you just instantly can continue where it left off and all of those tricks. So that's my kind of crazy idea.
I want to point out that
yeah.
everything you're saying is kind of like new possibilities of
Yeah,
response. It's
and all of these possibilities come from the fact that like it's HTML first, right? Like we have this idea that the HTML contains all the information to continue execution from.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to point that out, because when you start hearing about this, and developers might think that this might not work in their use case, and I think it's more about like things that are possible with this approach. Doesn't mean that client side will not work, right? This is not a trade-off of quick, And I think one of the things that I find extremely exciting is that pretty much all the previous frameworks, I'm talking about React or like especially React. No, this is a UI library, right? They didn't care about the data loading, or even like how styles work. They don't care about any other stuff, right? And that's nice. You can compose things, but then when you're building big applications, you come up with all these frameworks, like meta frameworks, and the thing is that some of these frameworks not only make the developer experience better, but they really solve fundamental lacking features of the underlying framework. So it's not only something they build to make it nice. It's like you cannot really do anything, right? You cannot. Right? And I think with Quick, our goal with Quick City, right, is to solve. It's like an approach to say like the how the routing works, how you can load different kind of MDX, like the developer experience, but really data loading or the asynchronous loading of data is something core of the framework, right? And we care about that. Like the whole thing can have, like the whole render can be async at any point, and that has a lot of implications that that we could talk about for hours.
I was gonna say another thing that occurred to me while Mishka was talking is like, because I was thinking, we come from a Ionic framework background, right, where we built a lot of client-side applications that would run on a local host on the device, right? It didn't actually have to go to the network and stuff. And so when you do client-side routing, it made sense because it was all centralized. So with the inner HTML way, it really wouldn't work because you need to hit a server. But then that gets back to kind of the Python concept of like, well, the service worker could be the server, and the service worker actually is the SSR server. So like we could still absolutely do all of that client side only, because and that's really how like our REPL works, like how the REPL works for the Quick City, is that it's really just a service worker responding with HTML. We could do that same thing with for capacitor apps in Ionic and things like that.
And there is one very cool transition APIs. I haven't looked very much into it, but this transition APIs that even between reloading the whole document, you can animate things. Have you guys look at that?
Yes,
I saw
that.
I think it's not supported very much, but this really was exciting for, kind of these very animated animations for MPLs.
I think people are mentioning micro front-ends in the chat. I think we should like jump into that.
Can I?
Yeah.
Well, actually, we'll just circle back separately. I'm writing notes on topics. I agree on micro front ends. I actually really want to circle back. We could do it afterwards, maybe, on what Adam said. I had never actually thought of that. The idea that your server can be the service worker, and we could even have, the client side doesn't care. It's just requesting HTML. If the service worker beat it and generated it's there, maybe not. You could even have a race situation, like by design, where the server might beat the service worker or whatever. But I agree. Let's touch on the question that was asked, micro front end. So please, Mishka, kick that off. We'll come back to the service worker, running quick applications and other threads. Obviously, we care about workers with PartyTown. It's cool to see the quick research there, but we can come back on that.
Yeah. So I think before we jump into micro front ends, I think the meta point has to be made, which is that the reason why Quick is in a situation where it can explore all of these new ideas and other frameworks are not really in that situation is because Quick can do one very interesting trick. And that is, if you think about it, it knows how to serialize the application, right? That's the thing that's missing out of all other frameworks. Existing frameworks don't know how to serialize the application, right? And they have this horrible workaround where like, we really write the HTML and then we do the hydration, which is kind of serious, but not really, right? Like, it's not the same thing. It's not like when you take data and you serialize it to JSON and then you restore it and you're exactly where you left off, right? Like the whole point of it is that you can serialize and continue and deserialize and etc. So the big difference here is that the Quick can do the serialization where any port of the application can be serialized at any point and then deserialize and continue. Now, the The added level on that is the containers. And the containers basically say, hey, instead of thinking about the whole page as a single humongous app, we can break this down into smaller chunks, right? And that beautifully opens you up for micro front ends, because micro front ends idea is like, well, the app is so large that we can't possibly have a single team working on this. We need to break up the team into smaller chunks, etc. And when you have an app that break up into multiple teams, the problem is that each team wants to be able to deploy independently, because actually it becomes even difficult to even get a proper build. Like it's difficult to get a build that is good across all of the sub teams. And so each sub team individually knows how to make a build that's good, but they don't know how to make it all together in the same, GitHub version or same shop when you have monorepo, etc. And so you need a way of like deploy and publish and roll back individual things independently, and the containers become your thing. Now, in order to do that, the magical bit is that the linking step of the containers has to happen in the browser, right? If the linking step happens as a build step inside of your development environment, well, then that's not really independent rollback, etc. Because like at this point, like, oh, you have to build a new artifact in order to roll back your stuff, and then building the artifact means that you could accidentally pull in new stuff that you weren't trying to deploy, etc. And so the real trick is to be able to do this. Now, we kind of already have this working. If you navigate to quick.builder.io, and if you open up the HTML that you get back, what you're going to see is that actually there are two containers. There is the outer container that comes from, I think, Vercel, which is kind of the application. And there is a second container that comes from the builder.io, right, which is the content from our builder editor. And if you look at the versions, you realize like, oh, the Vercel one actually is not even the same version as what Quick is serving. They're actually on two completely different versions. They're running different things. But they're linked together, and an end user is completely seamless. They don't even have to think about it. And so we kind of have most of this infrastructure already in place. It just requires, a few more kind of things on top of it. But it already kind of proves just how valuable it is to be able to pull code or pull content from different URLs that are put together. And if you look at the containers, you're going to see not just that they're running different versions, but they're also saying like where the code should come from. And you'll see that like each one points to a different URL. Like the one coming from Builder actually points to the Builder CDN, saying like, oh, if you have an interaction, it has to come from here. But the one on the top says, well, if you have an interaction, it has to come from Cloudflare. And the builds are separate, the pre-caching is separate. Like everything just kind of works the way you really want micro frontend to work. Anyways, I've been blabbing for a long time, and I see there's comments here, so I'm gonna shut up for a second.
I want to extend like one very exciting benefit of a framework that can be HTML first is that it kind of like ends the debate between SPA and MPA for most of the use cases. So if you use Remix or Next, right, they support MPA, and if you go to the docs, they will probably tell you, no JavaScript. You just go here and remove the scripts, right? You remove the scripts, and then your navigations become full pages. And if you use Remix, maybe some forms work kind of, and but then you don't get any interactivity, right? It's like it's a decision you have to make at a real high level. It's like, okay, my application might need this or not. And of course, you can have full page reload, but if you have the script, right, you will still have all the cost of the JavaScript, all the hydration, right? Everything. And I think one of the more interesting things with Quick is that it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if it's a SPA or a multiple page application, right? It's the same amount of JavaScript. Like it's the quick loader. It doesn't matter if it's interactive, it's client side, or it's a full page. It's the same, right? And I think that's kind of also like the mind blowing or changes, right? Or mind blowing things that Quick City can do, and I don't think any other can do at this point.
I think you could put it differently, right? Which is that in the existing frameworks, you as the developer have to make the decision, and that the decision is far-reaching across the whole application, right? Whereas in the Quick world, the Quick makes the decision for you, and it does it on per page section, right? And of course, because it has the resumability, if you have an interactivity on there, the interactivity can be lazy-loaded lazily rather than upfront, right? So you kind of get the best of everything.
And that's another thing. Like if you full page reload a React app, every reload is expensive, kind of, right? I mean, it's like the whole hydration needs to happen. And also I noticed this with the doc side. Like it's a full page, but it's not expensive. Like even if you see the performance, like it's nothing really happened, right? And if you have an MPA, but then you need reactivity and you have the scripts, like every page reload is like a lot of things happening every single time you click, right? So that's why you need client side. In that case, you really need it, right? So yeah.
So is this ending the debate of MPA versus SPA?
I highly doubt that.
I doubt it. But like, to me, like this whole divide between MP and SPA is kind of a symptom of the fact that our tools are kind of messed up, right? Like if our tools were just doing the right thing from the very beginning, I don't think we would have this debate.
Well, wasn't like in the way past, like if we step back and say, okay, like a lot of, I mean, some people have called Quick like the new jQuery. And I think they mean like this is a real, and Astro's in this camp and Marco's in this camp too. It's a real revisiting back to, and I guess Remix too, but like how Remix says it and how they deliver it sometimes is a bit different. They do some very cool stuff there. We're borrowing even more ideas, the loader concept, like cool stuff there. But a lot of people are pitching this idea of going back in time and focusing on the web fundamentals again, right? Like as you may be familiar, back in the day, you just served HTML. HTML is kind of the core primitive of the web browser. Even scripts and CSS is coming in through HTML tags. HTML is like that default. And even way back in the day, your web server would serve some HTML. And some of the early sort of uses of Ajax was fetch little pieces of HTML and stick those in to the DOM, right? That's actually kind of what we did way back because of this idea that the HTML is the primary or a primary primitive of the browser, and it's quite fast, right? Like I do a lot of tweets of CSS tutorials, not because I'm passionate about CSS, I'm passionate getting rid of JavaScript. Like if you could do something declaratively in the HTML directly, God, let's do it. Let's show cool tricks for that because JavaScript gets messy. And what's interesting, coming back a bit to the micro front ends that I'm not sure if we touched on, a lot of the use cases we see for micro front ends is also I have a team over here making a Svelte set of components, and a team over here making a React set of components, and a team over here making web components. And you not only have to stitch together multiple applications, like maybe multiple React apps, but in many cases, the ideal is to stitch together components from many frameworks, right? A large company might have their marketing site, creating everything in one framework, and the internal dashboard on something else, but some piece of the internal dashboard needs to surface in the marketing site. And loading multiple frameworks in the browser is awful, except when you realize in a similar way to Astro, with Quick, we have that ability to load in components from other frameworks and only hydrate them when needed. So you can actually have these super applications, this many micro front ends deliver very fast as HTML. And then if you go and interact with the Svelte component, you can hydrate that and continue forward and stuff like that. Which I think is a fascinating one and is helpful on sort of the value of Quick for micro front ends. But I also want to make sure we don't make this try not to make this a sales pitch for Quick. I think it's just Quick is top of mind because we're thinking about the problems and how we're able to solve them. But I do really want to circle back. We have another question, so we can get to that in a second. But I do want to circle back to, Adam, this idea of the service worker is your server is fascinating. I'm surprised that I'm like remembering you saying this right now. And I would love to elaborate on that because it has come up. Like, one of the biggest questions we get about Party Town is, can I run my React app? And we're like, you probably don't want to do that. Hopping across threads because all this referencing is ugly. But it's fascinating. We're exploring with Quick running in other threads entirely. I think we've done an okay job. We'll try and get better at better explaining like why you need code off of the main thread, and tapping the other threads actually can be very valuable. But I'll shut up now because I'd love to hear more about this from you, Adam.
Yeah, I mean, really, we made this possible because of making the REPL, which your REPL is basically, it has the entire server. So like the render to string, all of that code, which is traditionally ran on Node.js or any sort of actual backend server, it's really just JavaScript. It doesn't need to be on Node.js or Dino or whatever it is. And so in our case, we were able to just run that exact same render to string code within the service worker. So you kind of have all of your application running inside of this web worker, which a service worker is basically a web worker in a different thread. And as far as Quick is concerned, it only needs a string. It only needs HTML for it to work. And so we can have the entire application logic in the service worker, in the web worker. And then the main thread is only just like strings of HTML, right? And so any interactivity would go through the Quick loader, which is that, 1 kilobyte of code that's already in the HTML, is able to do the actual work of going between the two. And so that's something that I think is fairly not technically difficult with Quick. We haven't. I guess we've kind of proven it out with the REPL, because that's exactly how it works. And so I think it'd be more fun to have some starters that work in that way and get more people experimenting with like what's possible doing that.
That's also one of the really cool parts about this idea of new edge runtimes coming out. So we've got like Dino, we've got Cloudflare Workers, we have Bun that just came out. They're really leaning on.
Yeah.
Yeah, people are really buzzing about Bun. And actually, there's some interesting stuff about Bun. I really took it with a grain of salt at first. I was actually, I guess, in the minority of like, why do we need another JS VM? And just because it's written in what's the language? Fig? Did I get that wrong? Zig? Sorry. The language it's using is actually pretty interesting, but like the stats compared to Dino were interesting. I'm sure Dino would have their own stats of why Dino's wildly faster at XYZ. But the cool part is this idea that everybody's leaning on a core set of primitives for building web servers, which are based on the browser. So you can move to this point where you're building applications that run in the, you know, I almost want to call legacy JS VMs like Node.js to the newer ones to the browser. And these applications could just run anywhere: edge, server, desktop, service worker. It's pretty fascinating. But I want to come back over to a couple of questions we have. One from Nico, one from Ryan. But the first one, let me give a quick swing at this and let anybody jump in on it. But the question is, what is the good way to measure Quick? I think it means sort of against other frameworks. For example, I run Lighthouse and get 100% in Angular, and the same with Quick. So this is actually a very fundamental and very difficult question. I've actually talked to Ryan about too, because one thing that's kind of hard is when you make a framework that solves a problem that you don't encounter when you make a Hello World app, you encounter when you actually finish a real production grade app. And even more so when you have 10 years or multiple years of marketing team ask, product team ask, all this stuff you layer in, and then you wind yourself in this terrible problem of my application now is really slow. So we see it all the time. People sort of unclear on how to measure the performance of their application. You see this happen all the time. Don't worry, I'll get to you, Mana, very shortly. You see this happen like crazy. Somebody makes their brand new application in, I won't name a specific framework, just any framework. All the application does is print hello worlds. They test it on their Lighthouse, on their M1 MacBook, on a local server, and they say, wow, 100 out of 100. This framework is a great framework. It's like every website is fast when it just says does hello world. The real test is a full production grade website that's got third-party scripts, tons of functionality. It's got multiple teams in your company that have needs that have to be worked into this website. And then it's tested in a system that emulates real-world conditions, an imperfect mobile device on an imperfect 3G network. And that's where we lean on Google PageSpeed Insights for mobile that does a pretty good job at most of that. I wouldn't recommend most people go through every single Lighthouse recommendation and try and solve them piecemeal. I think frameworks like Quick are trying to have holistic solutions that wipe out many of those suggestions in one, because trying to address them individually is its own extremely complicated problem. But yeah, the hard part is how do you make, sometimes there's this impact, there's this thing, I forget, there's a name for it, but companies obsess over what's easy to measure, right? Actually, Mishko has a whole thing about, cholesterol, and how we focus on cholesterol because it's too easy to measure. But it is a real problem. When something's easy to measure, people hyper-focus on it because you can point at it. So the simple example here is frameworks always being valued by their ability to insert rows into a table quickly, that one benchmark that we all have seen. And what we're lacking is a real sort of standard measurement of time to interactive. Like how long does it actually take a complex website to load? And the problem is to actually create that, you have to build ridiculously complex websites in every framework that are identical in every other way, which is, how do you do that? We thought maybe mitosis would help, but maybe one cool thing is Vue Storefront is looking at mitosis to build the next generation of what they'll call Storefront UI, framework agnostic. So that might be a good example of a full e-commerce store that we can load in different frameworks and measure them against each other with like a Google PageSpeed Insights. So I think the briefer answer is there isn't a perfect way. And if you make a brand new site in X framework and you measure it on Lighthouse and you see it's fast, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a fast choice over time. And so I'll pause there because I know Mana really wants to jump in on that too before we go to another question.
Yeah, no, I wanted to say that first, performance, I'm measuring is extremely complicated, right? So you always find what is you do different kind of testing, it's like what are you measuring? And I think with Quick, you have to go and think how the other frameworks, right? Most of the complex, at least the minimum complexity you get is from the amount of things, the amount of components, the amount of code that represent the system page, right? Even if you have lazy loading all over your components, the things that are in the page, they have to be loaded, right? So you can spend a massive amount of engineering to make things fast. Like, of course, you can make everything, you can make it fast. I think the difference with Quick is that the amount of complexity or the amount of JavaScript that pretty much slows all the websites down is a function of the interactivity of the website. It's not a function of the amount of components that represents the whole page, right? So I think the benefit you start seeing is with when your application has not only like thousands of components in the whole project, but your the viewport, like the visible part of the website actually has a lot of stuff, right? And at that point is when Quick, by default, right, without a massive amount of engineering effort, performs much better by default. I think that's kind of the benefit that we are seeing in very complex applications. Again, probably not response to the question of how do you measure, right? But
I want to just drop a little quick tidbit over there.
Quick
So I like to generalize things because that's me. And the way to think about it is that existing frameworks are O of n, which is that as the complexity of the application or as the complexity of the page gets more complicated, the cost to start up goes up, and it is a linear relationship, right? And what frameworks really are arguing over is like whose line has less slope. Like, oh, I am 20% better at the slope of the line than you are, or I am 20% better at the initial zero intercept than you are, or something of that sort, right? But at the end of the day, like it's still O of n, right? Like, yeah, the line is slightly different, but it's still O of n, right? And the thing that Quick has going for it is its startup is O of 1, right? It doesn't matter how big your application is. The cost to start up is always flat and same. And that is kind of the differentiation. And of course, if you have a hello world, you're not going to see much of a difference. But as the complexity of the application goes up, at some point, the O of 1 is really going to start to shine. And the fact that you have a linear slope in all other frameworks is really what's going to get to you. So just adding that.
O1, right, in absolute terms, can still be slower than ON.
Yeah. But in our case,
it's where you see the benefit, right?
Yes.
And another thing that we don't really hit on enough is that you've got imagine a large application. You've got the header and the left menu and the footer and all that stuff. It took JSX to build that, but when it comes to the actual runtime of the application, the code knows that it's impossible to re-render this. It knows that there's no button to re-render the left menu or the header or anything like that. So none of that code ends up on the client because it knows it's not possible. So there can be, depends on the site or depends on the application, but there can be a large chunk of code that just is never actually executed versus, other frameworks having to run the code to see if it ever has to execute again. So that's another big difference.
100%. We have we've got a few questions come in here, so we'll try and grind through these because I think those are great. I actually want to briefly touch on one. No, I'll come back to it. We'll stick to the order. So first one that we hadn't gotten to yet is, Mishka, why the name Quick?
Oh, originally it was cute. When we joined forces with Builder, I think we chatted with the engineers, and Quick, my only requirement was that it has to start with the letter Q because I was in love with that particular letter. And so after we chatted, it was like, oh, fast and quick kind of go together. So it's a misspelling on the word quick. So I think that's the story.
It's because you wanted
that's the story. I'm sticking to it.
QRL, right?
Yes, the Q was there
because
I wanted to use QRL. Yes, because I thought it was hilarious.
Now we want to remove URL.
We are trying to remove that. We're making a concept developers never have to worry about, like, what is the term? Make it an abstraction that never leaks. You never have to actually care firsthand. But yeah, maybe part of the question is why do we spell it so weird? I don't know.
This weird spelling is because of SEO, right? Like you want to be able to differentiate yourself. If you literally spelled it quick, as in like quick is spelled correctly, right?
Never find
then
it.
Like good luck showing up on SEO.
When I joined Builder, I thought it was because Google also make quick, the HTTPS replacement. I thought it was. I thought it was like related, like.
I mean, one thing that was a big debate is how many letters do we misspell? That's caused some confusion. I've seen people write quick on Twitter in a lot of different ways, and it's kind of like, I used to have a general rule with naming that you need to have one misspelling, and once you have more, it's a problem. And I think we did 3. So, but I for some reason I find it fun to type. So I think we're definitely sticking with it.
But it makes it super difficult to talk about quick and how it's quick in startup.
Yes. Okay, so Ryan asked a really good and more in-depth question. And so specifically it is, can we talk to a more concrete routing example? He says, I think nested server routing is interesting because sure, the nested content changes, but other parts of the page update like tab changes. And so Adam, I'm curious your thoughts on this. I mean, that's a common question in general, right? Like say tab changes is an interesting one. I have tabs on my page. I go to the next tab. Could I just have the next tab be prefetched HTML and load instantly? Should that be via JavaScript? How are we thinking about sort of the nested routing, maybe more concrete real world examples, how you write that and how that loads, and where we're seeing some interesting parity with those things too?
Yeah, for the most part, we can do Quick City does the nesting layouts and nesting page. So the lowest level is the page that you have, and then you can have as many, layouts wrapping it at that point. And so when, at build time, we're able to figure out, who's all the parent layouts. And then at runtime, we, loop through and we build this structure of, this is the lowest one, this is the wrapper, this wrapper. And at that point, my job is done. That's all Quick that takes care of it from that point. Because really Quick, if I had written that structure myself and rendered it, Quick would do all the right things where it knows like, well, this isn't usable, this is usable, we need to re-render this section because this button was clicked. All of that stuff is just out of the box from Quick. So really, Quick City is just about, at build time, figuring out what is this hierarchy. And when you go to this URL, build this hierarchy. But then after that, it's really Quick's runtime that's able to decide if this thing is able to re-render. And then if none of the content change, but one, activated button, CSS class name change somewhere in the stack, that's entirely on Quick that's able to optimize that.
I think when we start to implement nested layouts, personally, I found this, nested layouts has a beautiful software engineering aspect. And it reminds me of, so some years ago, I built this framework called Gene. It's like a web framework like Express. And in other frameworks, you start to think like this like very complex of many different things. This is a layout, this is a page, this is something. And then you realize that, for example, in Express, right, all the middlewares are like, it's just one, next, and the other middlewares has a chance to do something, like has a chance to block the request or catch or measure some stuff. And it passes. And the last one, right, is the actual kind of request, right? And the previous one are middlewares, but they are all the same. Like conceptually, they are the same element, right? And when we start to implement layouts in Quick City, we realize that layouts are just pages, right? Are just pages with a slot. And at the end of it, a request is a chain of pages, right? A chain of middlewares, and the last one maybe is the page, right? And I think this beautiful concept, right? Even in the software, it's like beautiful. It's like just an array of pages, right? That turn out to be layouts, but they are just pages. And I think this concept has a lot of beauty. It's like a good principle. I mean, for Ryan, I will say is the signals. I'm in love with that. It's like such a beautiful, simple concept. And I think nested layouts has one of those, and from that you get a lot of nice properties like the ones we described before.
Yeah, because Quick City provides a content component, and that's exactly what you described. And I remember working with you, Manu, on how this is going to work. And when we finish the code, it's like 4 lines of code. I'll just like loop through the stack of the components and build up the children of this component, and it's done. I mean, so like the content component itself is extremely simple, because we do a lot of work at build time to know what the hierarchy is. But as far as the runtime is concerned, it's really nothing to it. And then at that point, it's entirely a Quick application. How does Quick handle these components stacked together is out of Quick City's thought process at all.
Exactly.
I think maybe, sorry to interject here, I think we should talk about a little bit about how existing meta frameworks kind of are patching over missing parts of the underlying framework, like for example, lazy loading of resources, because the underlying framework don't know how to render asynchronously, and how we're trying to push down things directly into the framework, the quick. So the quick city is really just this tiny little shell, not to diminish the hard work you've been working on, but like the less stuff in quick city, the better, right?
Yeah, you want to cover that, Manu? I mean, like, so for the most part, all the frameworks out there today, meta frameworks out there today, have some sort of way to load the data on the server or on the client, and then pass that completed data, whether it's async or not, pass it down to the framework, and the framework just blows through it and renders it out really quick. And so Next.js has the get static props and get server side static props. SvelteKit has a loader, or has load. Remix has loader. So they all have the same way of doing kind of the same concept. And
I think
so
you should point out, what the problem is. Like, why do they need to have these things? Like, without this, what would happen?
Yeah, so like somehow they load the data up front as this big object of data. And then when they pass it to the framework just knows how to take data and render it, like place these little bits here into this HTML. And so really the framework is just purely a renderer. It doesn't have a way of asynchronously slowing things down and saying like, now let's try to load this, let's do a fetch at this point and request some more information. Once I get the fetch, let's put it into this slot inside of a div. And so does that answer your question? Like, that's kind of how they're different, is that the framework isn't concerned, or framework is synchronous, basically.
Yeah.
It already has completed data and it just renders it out as fast as possible. Whereas Quick has an async render, and it's able to instead, especially on the server side of things, it's able to load data before it continues throughout the rendering tree.
I think the problem is that because existing frameworks are synchronous, the meta framework needs to know at which point to take a snapshot or which point to serialize the stuff, right? Or in the case of like, if you're concatenating strings and you're serializing, you're like, oh, I have to have all the data available if I need to start concatenating the strings to generate the HTML. There's no way to go back. And so the problem becomes like, well, how do I make sure that everything is synchronously available, right? And when you flip it around and you have a rendering pipeline that is asynchronous, then you can do it in a more natural way, where you just say, okay, start rendering. And when you come across an asynchronous data loading, because it's a resource you have to get asynchronously, it's okay to pause rendering, fetch the data, and then when the data shows up, like continue rendering where you left off, which I think also falls really nicely to the idea of streaming. But I mean, that's a maybe topic for a different day.
Yeah, right.
Well, that's why. Yeah, I was dying to get to that one. Ryan just pointed it out, and that's awesome. I'm muting to add. So yes, that was the original topic I wanted to go into, and maybe I'll add just a tiny prelude, and we'll kick back to you, Mishko, and everybody else wants to jump in. Apologies for those in the chat. We're going out of order. I'm going to try and save the last 5 minutes to rip through maybe quick answers to any remaining questions. We'll see if we can do that. But streaming is the big topic, and I've been noticing as I'm using Quick, the fact that everything's asynchronous is fascinating. You can have asynchronicity within hooks, like the resource fetchers work in a very fascinating way compared to like a React. It's like re-render. We don't actually have that situation, or we have the flexibility to do it in more interesting ways, which has impacts on streaming and knowing, when we can send certain things. And this being just a fundamental piece of the framework that I think something that was crystal clear with existing frameworks is the hard requirement of synchronicity became a huge challenge that we're getting these crazy workarounds to try and resolve. And when asynchronicity is built into the framework and every element can be asynchronous, to be honest, when I first saw that, I was like, oh, are we going to hit issues? Everybody else does it another way. What's going to happen? And it's wild what the other three people in this room have come up with to actually make it incredibly elegant and make it a huge strength across the board. So I'll shut up now because Mishko, please take over on streaming, because that's a fascinating sort of byproduct and thing here.
Yeah, so the streaming, the idea is that like you want to send things into the wire, right, as soon as you can. And so if you have a synchronous rendering model, then that becomes a problem, because that means like once you start sending things into the stream, you can't stop, because there's no way to recover, because the only way you know how to recover is to re-render from the root again. And so you need a way of having the ability to pause. So the advantage for Quick is twofold, right? One is that it can pause the rendering halfway through, but also that it can render things out of order. And so all of these things together really give you a lot of freedom into, setting up your application so that you can stream or like do things in parallel and then eventually merge streams together or things of that sort. So I think that's like a super exciting area.
I think another another of the things that Quick solves really well, I think, is when other frameworks have asynchronous stuff, they kind of say, okay, you put a promise here, and then it's on you to keep all the rest of the guarantees. Okay, like the order of things might be not okay. You may have race conditions. Like there are things that might not work as you expect, right? And I think this is also, we have this conversation with Dan Abramov from React, right? And he was really like into that, like how are you going to keep like a strong guarantees of the execution order and all these things, no? And I think that we can figure it out at the core of React. Like you can still write the code internally. You get all some of this async the benefits of writing code asynchronous, but for the developer, right, you still have like very strong guarantees of the order of the execution of the hooks, like how changes are committed into the DOM, that you will not see things flickering even if there are two independent components. Like the whole reactive system. I think also there's other framework like Solid also figured this out with the transitions. But that's not a thing in other frameworks, right? And then you have all this meta framework type to solve it, but they not quite. And I think for a modern framework, this is a must-have to have, right? Especially with all this data loading and asynchronous.
Yeah, the asynchronous rendering pipeline is one of those things that is super hard to explain, like why you would want it to have it. But once you have it, you realize so many things just open up, and not just open up, but like they work the way they should have been working from the very beginning, right? They're like, you look at it, you go like, of course that's the way it should be working. Like, how else would you do it? And then you realize, well, actually, there are other frameworks that do it this other way, and it's actually problematic, and they have all these weird workarounds. Like my perfect example of that is like, I think React Suspense is like a perfect example of this weird workaround for the fact that you just can't stop rendering. Like if you could only stop rendering and wait for something and then resume where you left off, like a lot of stuff would be so much simpler, but you can't do it. So you have this weird suspense as a workaround.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a hot take or not. I have a lot of issues with React Suspense. I don't know if I want to go into that. That's probably its own topic another time, as well as one topic we need to talk about another time is our issues with web components too, because that comes up with these conversations sometimes, and those are challenging conversations to have because of the point of views people have on them sometimes. But given we only have 9 minutes before end of stream, want to try and see if we can rock through a couple questions. I'm going to touch on one, and I want to fully address one, and then we may have room for another one or two. So one that did come up is this idea of page navigation being different than client-side routing. And I think that refers to the page transitions API. So that's one to go into more that I think is interesting. And Ryan asked a question that is related but unrelated. So, okay, you're flipping around tabs, are you inner HTMLing between the two? I think the really brief answer on our side is we're exploring all of this. I think the only thing we feel kind of grounded in on the quick side is we have a new set of primitives that gives us a new set of possibilities. And we have some fundamental differences like the HTML first and the async rendering and the quick loader. And so basically, I think the real answer is, what is Quick's opinion on how to do this? I don't think there's a strong opinion on this is how all tabs must work just yet. What we're trying to do is find that balance of where should the framework guide you? What options should you have versus sort of be automated? And I think the reality is we'll probably explore several options, and some of them put in the developer's control. Things like prefetching is fully configurable, but there's good defaults and we have recommendations. But we do know that, we're dealing with big kids. You need to be able to make the choices that are best for your application as well. So we're not going to be overly prescriptive here. And I think this is something that we'll see how it evolves over time. We are moving the entirety of the builder site, which includes our documentation, our blog, and all that stuff to Quick. We are moving more and more party town docs and that. And so we're building more real world applications and working with people in the ecosystem, which can touch on another question, which is, are we going to have expert programs like GDE, MVP, et cetera? That's definitely the plan, right? We have people already coming to us who want to be experts in Quick, be trained, et cetera, because we know that's an important thing we learned with the builder platform. Company wants to use it. They want a place to go for expert help. That might be someone who's more available than the core team, on a moment's notice. But one other question that I think is funny but great, and I think we'll get it a lot, so I do want to clarify, and it might give me a chance to mention one other thing that we care about on this topic, is I love this question. With Quick City, do you guys have hosting plans yet, or where can we host it? And so what I think is funny about the question, it is a very good question, is everybody assumes that if you're making a framework, you're making a hosting platform. In fact, it drives me crazy that we're seeing this happen over and over and over. Everybody makes a framework and a hosting platform, or you're making a VM and a hosting platform. Like the way to monetize open source is always, in everybody's minds, hosting platforms. One thing I want to be clear to everybody, we're not building a hosting platform. We don't make a hosting platform. We don't intend to make a hosting platform. Quick works fantastically out of the box with Netlify, Vercel, Cloudflare. The idea is to support all of these options, and some will be very first class supported. Anything else will run. It just runs in any JavaScript VM that you like. So we like that optionality. I think this opens up a slightly broader question is like, okay, if you're not trying to make us pay for you hosting, like, why are you making this, right? And so that's maybe where I can do a really brief screen share. Let's see how well this works and show something that we call, Manu coined this. We call it, can you all see my screen?
I can see now like some database geeks getting mad at me for this. So
yeah, this is not locked in stone, but you could see what I'm
Yes.
screen sharing now, right? Okay, cool. So right now we're loosely calling this the front-end cap theorem. For those who are familiar with the cap theorem in databases, I always forget what the three letters are, but specifically it's like with a database, you want three things. You can only ever get 2 out of 3. That's why there's no single database architecture to rule them all. There's different databases for different needs. A large part of this is because of just the fact that networks are not instantaneous. So as you distribute things, you get trade-offs, et cetera, et cetera. So we look at everything we do as this, what we kind of call the front-end cap theorem. We see people tweeting online about this. The idea is that it's all too commonly accepted that you get performance, functionality, and experience, like developer experience, as a pick 2 out of 3 at best. So a simple example would be you make a React website, has all the features that you want. It's a nice experience. It's components, right? And so you get experience and functionality, but the performance at any reasonable scale is pretty abysmal. Your Google PageSpeed Insights is going to give you a terrible score. And we also recognize that developers don't live in a bubble. They don't live in isolation. They live as part of a larger team. The team members have needs. They need to do A/B testing and personalization and all this stuff. And you could look at it from another combination of things. Let's say you just need performance and functionality. There is a lot of Quick's ideas on performance come from an internal framework at Google made by Malti, who's at Vercel now, where arguably the performance and functionality is there, but the developer experience is wildly more complicated than the React-style component model that Quick brings to the equation. And there's many ways you could hard code personalization without good tools to power it. I mean, there's many ways you can dice this up where you get 2 out of the 3 things. And what we deeply care about is having all 3. On the side of Quick, it's all about that first-party code where you build it with the standard, components are the building blocks of the web. They are the way that developers reason about code, encapsulate complexity, and make a really good, solid, and maintainable developer experience. But with that, we want both runtime performance and load time performance, and we're not seeing that with other component-based frameworks. That's your first-party code. Next, we recognize, again, you're a business with needs. You will also need third-party code. That's why Partytown came into this equation. We made the builder homepage with Quick. We ignored, despite Adam reminding us constantly that we can't ignore third-party scripts. We're going to need Google Analytics, Amplitude, various other sort of measurements and third-party conversion trackers, stuff like that, to run an actual business. And that's where it became obvious, where Partytown was strictly needed was when our Quick site was getting 100 out of 100 score, yet we add third-party scripts and drops down to 60. That's a huge issue. And so moving it to the worker thread, moving any of this stuff that must run because it's not your code, so you can't edit it the way you like, moving it into another environment like the worker environment can be a powerful solve for those certain use cases. And then you end up with one last problem, which is like, okay, when we move things to the edge, we can deliver content on a per visitor basis. We can deliver personalized content. We can deliver A/B test variations. We can do all kinds of things. Yet if you're hard coding that stuff, or even using low level tools like LaunchDarkly is an amazing tool for feature flagging. We use it for Builder. It's not necessarily a tool to let your marketing team go in and run some A/B tests on your site without the developer actually having to modify and push code, which gets ugly. So when we really look at things in terms of the developer experience, we really also care about maintaining the performance, having the full functionality, and the developer should still reason about components. and that's specifically where the builder platform, where its place is in this, is this idea that when you build these massive templates with 1 million form fields coming off of your, structured data CMS, the maintenance is awful. The amount of data you have to bind. One funny way Mishko puts it is you have this paradox where you constantly simultaneously have too little fields and too many. Your CMS has hundreds of fields. You're educating your marketing team on, use this field to add a button here and blah, 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 blah. It becomes a bit of a mess. Yet you don't have enough because the marketing team needs a different button color. They need a different section. It becomes kind of a mess. And that's why we have our system where you get this sort of low code environment, connects to your code, connects to your components, drag and drop and compose them in different ways. And we found that we were able to, with the sort of API driven, component driven approach, we can deliver in a very automatic way using the edge and stuff like that, those personalized variations, those A/B test variations. Your code is not chasing these things down. Your marketing or other teams are just clicking to say, okay, menswear shoppers should see this, publish, women's wear should see this, publish. Your code's pulling that over an API and sending it. But one thing we noticed too is we were very proud of the performance of the builder platform. You could have it as a zero cost abstraction, adding a ton of functionality, getting a ton of marketing requests off your plate, this and that. Yet people were hooking up into front-end frameworks like React and still seeing slow performance speeds because of things around the builder platform, the things around what builder was powering within your website. And so that's where it became even more important that if you're going to solve all of these pieces, you need a good system for loading your website with as little JavaScript and as high speed as possible. Your third-party scripts need an environment to run that is not weighing you down. You need a way to power this content, the personalization, and the A/B testing that removes a ton of burden from developers, but does not add any performance cost. We could cover that in more depth another time, but I did want to just poke at that briefly. We're essentially out of time now. Let me double check the chat, see if nothing crazy came in. Okay, I think... Yes, there's another good one for future time. Quick across UI frameworks like Ionic and other things. We have a couple people who know Ionic here pretty well. So why don't we pick up on some of the stuff next time? We'll find another topic just for everybody. Thank you for joining. Thank you for interacting with us over the chat. We have some good stuff to feed next topics. We will start posting these on YouTube Live in advance, and we'll be here at the same time every single week. This was a ton of fun, and thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, everyone.